So Mary is invited by God to birth the Messiah. And what is her first response after she says yes? Her first response is, yay, the poor are going to be helped, yes. The oppressed are going to be liberated. She sings a song of justice and liberation. You know, the church, especially art, paints this picture of Mary as this young, very fair girl dressed in blue, very sweet and docile. And I used to see for counselling a woman who was a Catholic woman who was abused in her church, not sexually, but in every other way. And I would ask her how she felt about that. And she said, well, I must be like the Blessed Mother, silent. And I said, Mary wasn't silent. Mary was a radical. She talked about liberation for poor people and the rich getting what they deserved. Mary was a radical. She was a fighter for the rights of her people. And so are the best mothers in the Bible. There's women like Sarah who couldn't care less and sends her stepson off into the desert. But the mothers we admire stood up for their people, stood up for God, stood up for their children. Women like Mary. Women like Eunice and Lois and Deborah. So our first two radical mums of the morning are Eunice and Lois, Timothy's mother and grandmother. And we first meet them in Acts 16. I should have put that in the list, but it's Acts 16 and I can read it. Acts 16 verse 1. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in that place, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So, 4 short verses. What do we know about Timothy and Eunice and Lois? Now, Timothy is a Greek name. So clearly his dad was a big part of his upbringing, and he wasn't circumcised, so he was not part of the Jewish community. But Lois and Eunice had taught him everything about the Jewish faith. So he'd learned the scriptures. They probably, they would have memorized them, and they would have taught Timothy by rote. But I'm sure they shared stories too, told him, stories of Moses and the Exodus and Noah, all the great stories of the Bible, so that he grew up to know and love God. And then when those two women became Christian, they made sure that Timothy became a Christian. So they're amazing. They didn't say things like, Eunice didn't say, well, my husband's Greek, that's fine, no problem. And we don't know how he felt about this. We're not even told his name. So was he happy Greeks were fairly tolerant, but did Lois and Eunice have to sort of meet in secret, go out for coffee and take Timothy with them, or was he happy with this? But there she was in a mixed marriage, a mixed household, and she and Lois made sure that Timothy grew up to know his Jewish faith, and then they brought him to Jesus so he would know Jesus. And he became one of the New Testament's greatest leaders. He became Paul's right-hand person for a while. He and Paul fell out, but Paul fell out with everybody he went on mission trips with. And I love how the writer of 2 Timothy talks about the sincere faith that was passed down from grandma to mother to son. Because it's one thing to say, well, in our house we're all Jewish, or in our house we're all Catholic, and that's it. You say, well, I'm Catholic or I'm Jewish. But it was sincere faith. They taught him to love God. And that is that. I'm sure it was lots of stories. And so this marvelous young man came from a multi-generational home, a multi-faith home, and a mixed nationality home. There are towns in America where you'd be run out of town for living like that. But that produced this wonderful, wonderful young man. And we know so little about their circumstances, and we won't this side of heaven. But we do know that raising children in a diverse family is difficult. And Lois and Eunice, they nailed it. They were a power couple for God. So anybody have any thoughts or ideas or insights into these two? They were powerful people, and they were godly people. And often in the Bible, those two things go hand in hand. When a just cause needs leadership, it was women who stepped forward. When doing the right thing took an act of courage, it was women who bravely carried on. And when faith was under threat, it was women who pointed the way God would. So how about Deborah? I mean, talk about amazing women in the Bible, right? This story is set about 1,200 years before Jesus, in what we call, in terms of historical, it was the Bronze Age. That is, Israel was in the Bronze Age, Canaan had moved on to the Iron Age. And you know, when the Israelites moved into, we have the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. It didn't happen quite like that. They moved into this land, and they had a cluster here and a cluster there, a family here, a tribe there. And the Canaanites hated them because they were immigrants, you know, but this is where we are in this country and in parts of England and parts of Europe. So the immigrants were hated by the Canaanites, and the immigrants hated the Canaanites because this is our land. God's given us this land. So there was constant wars. All the time there were wars or skirmishes. And it says in Judges 5 that so business and trade closed down because people were afraid to travel with things to sell because they'd be robbed and mugged, and women were raped if they went out. It was a terrible time of violence. And for 20 years, this evil man Sisera commanded the Canaanite troops. And he had, it says, 900 chariots of iron. They were like tanks. You imagine he had 900. And the Israelites only had bows and arrows because they didn't know how to smelt iron. So they were like, you know, the people who've not yet mastered how to use a cell phone, the sort of the techno idiots. They were the Israelites. They were back in the Bronze Age, and the Canaanites had moved on. They had heavy weaponry, and if you've got 900 chariots and the other army only have bows and arrows, you know, forget about it. You're not going to stand a chance. But God said to Deborah, I want you to defeat Sisera. And God came up with a military strategy. Who knew that God did that? And Deborah says, okay, God, and she calls Barak, her commander-in-chief, and she says, God's got a plan that we can defeat Sisera. I want you to lead the army against him. And Barak's like, I don't think so. And then what does he say to her? Now remember, she's like the head person. She's the judge. She's a prophet. And what does he say to her?
I'll go if you go with me.
Yes, yeah, yes, yeah. Yeah, I'll go if you go with me. Yes, yeah. This is, this is one scared man. He's like, this is like, you know, Zelensky versus Putin. Only instead of, you know, Putin has nuclear weapons, Sisera had chariots, and Barak's like, you know, you first. And she went first. She went at the head of the forces, and Judges 5 tells us that she sang victory songs. You know, we're going to win. God's on our side. We're going to win. So if you're God, and even though God loves peace, God can do war if it's needed. And you've got poorly armed people against heavy weaponry. If you're God, how might you organize that? The answer is actually in chapter 5, which we didn't go to. So this is to test your military strategy. How might you organize a battle, bows and arrows against heavy armory?
Well, if the bows and arrows people were up higher.
Yeah, if the bows and arrows people were up higher.
You know, you could aim down and...
Yeah, and then what's another thing about an iron chariot? Anybody got an iron frying pan?
Yeah.
They're heavy,
yeah.
Extremely heavy. So an iron chariot was extremely heavy. They couldn't really go uphill.
I was going to say those poor horses.
Yeah, the poor horses.
Those iron
yeah.
chariots.
So God tells Deborah, who tells Barak to assemble all their forces on top of the hill. And then God sends heavy rain and flash floods.
Oh, good, rust.
Before the rust, the bottom of the hill is a flood and a mud and a mire, and all the horses get stuck.
Yep.
All the horses and chariots get stuck. And so the bow and arrow, the archers run down the hill and slaughter everyone. And everybody was killed, every one of their army was killed, except Sisera, the evil general. And then he runs off into the desert. And in the desert, there were lots of nomadic tribes like there are today. And the nomads were neutral in this fight between the Canaanites and the Israelites. They were traders, they were craftspeople. And yeah, they were like, don't involve us in this. But according to Jewish tradition, this is not in the Bible, a young woman called Yael had been raped by one of Sisera's army. This is a tradition, not in the Bible. And she invited Sisera into her tent. She said, oh, you poor man. Oh, you look exhausted. Come and sit down in my tent. And she gives him a bowl of milk, probably with some little herbs in it. And when he falls asleep exhausted, she rams a tent peg through his temple and kills him, because women built tents. And Judges 5, the whole of Judges 5 is a song of praise. And we have to think about it because there's a lot of violence. And we know God is not a violent God. God wants peace. But for 20 years, the Israelites have been murdered, mugged, raped, tortured, suffered terribly. So God called Deborah to free the people. And Judges 5 says she became the mother. Mothers will do what it takes to take care of their kids, even if it's something like this. And it ends with the line, Israel, the land rested for 40 years. That means Israel had peace for many, many years. 40 years is a round number, but it meant a long, long time. So even though we're a little bit shocked, even though they would probably ban the story in the southern United States right now, this is showing that God will protect the vulnerable ones and will raise up, and a mum raise up, and the dad, Barak's like, forget about that. But Deborah takes it on and she defeats this man, and we judge it not by our horror at the violence, but it said it gave Israel 40 years of peace, and that could mean much longer than our 40 years, just a long, long time of peace. So sometimes mothers and grandmothers are like Lois and Eunice, and sometimes they have to be like Deborah, taking on evil and fighting evil for that. And you think about sometimes mothers who go after drug dealers or go after these satanic cults, and a mother will stand up because that's what mothers do. They stand up for the welfare of their kids. We're called to stand in the gap, not just of our own children, but of children.
Yes.
And of the planet. We are called, and fathers are too. Actually, fathers,
Communities.
yes, are also called to mother. So when we see, gun violence, all of us who are mothers, we should all be standing in the gap and saying, nobody is allowed to walk into Congress until guns are banned. Deborah stood in the gap for her community, and that's what mothers do. So Mary. I like Mary, and I dislike what the church has done to her. And she's our final honoree. Well, her name was Mariam. It was a nice Jewish name. And King Herod, one of his wives was called Mariam, and everybody loved this wife. He had lots of wives. So everybody was a Mariam for a while, every girl born. And we know very little about her. We know that she came from an impoverished backwater in the Roman Empire. We know that she trusted God, and we know that she loved her son. And if you read the Gospels, you'll find that Mariam was always worried about Jesus. That she was often exasperated with Jesus, and that she constantly thought he was going to do something amazing. And isn't that like all mums? You worry about them. You're exasperated with them. And you're like, come on, you can do this. You can be whatever, the chief of surgery, the head of the Supreme Court, the Messiah. But you know, when the Christian theology was mainly written in about the 4th and 5th century, and in those days, women were considered completely inferior to men, and women's bodies were considered inferior. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said that women were half a man. So as these mainly Greek men were writing Christian theology, they couldn't write that this good Jewish girl had had Jesus. So they turned her into a Greek goddess. They changed her name to the same sort of name as the Greek goddesses had. They dressed her in robes that the Roman empress would have had. And then they said she had a completely different gynecological system to normal women. That poor Mary, they changed her into someone whose only act for God was to have some sort of weird obstetrical event. But we know from the passage that Linda went, she agreed to birth Jesus because God was saying, we're going to solve the issues that Mary already cared about. Mary didn't suddenly spout that hymn of praise because of her hormones. Mary thought about this. How can we help the poor? How come the rich have everything? What about those Romans? She'd been thinking about these things. And when God said, would you like to have the Messiah? It's like, yes, you know. Yes, I've been wanting to do this stuff. And probably Joseph too. Yes, this is our cause. So it was Miriam's love for social justice, her commitment to the poor, to the downtrodden, that she said, yes, I will do this. And Joseph agreed. They collaborated with God to birth goodness and kindness and compassion, even though they guessed that they were also birthing suffering and struggle, because it was very hard bringing up Jesus. It must have been awful watching him die. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite heroes of modern times was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who he was a German Lutheran minister who took on the Nazis and was hanged by Hitler in 1945. And his parents only learnt of his death on the BBC radio. Wow. That's how they knew he died. And they were an amazing Christian family, and you'd want to say to them, are you sorry you had him? Are you sorry he stood up against it? And yeah, Mrs. Mum was shaking her head. Of course not. They were pleased they had him. They were grateful he was one of the people who took on Hitler, just like Miriam and Joseph. It's like, yes, we'll do this. We will birth a boy who will grow up to take on evil, to take on the Roman Empire, to take on greed and hatred and prejudice and poverty. We'll do that. And we're guessing it's going to end pretty badly, but we're okay with this. And yet we've reduced Miriam to this poor, blue dress, blonde haired girl who was sort of a victim of God. She was a fiery fighter for her people. She was a fiery fighter for God. And she stood up for what God needed to get done in the world. She birthed God's goodness and God's love and God's kindness. And we still need people to do that. We still need people to understand that God is our mother, and that you don't do things to your mother like kill her other kids. We still need to get out the word that God is the mother of everybody, of Russians and Ukrainian, of every different tribe in Sudan, of the people with machine guns in America and the people without machine guns in America, with immigrants. We need to get them to know that God is the mother of us all. And we are all on God's maternity team. Amen? Amen. Amen. God is our mother.
Yes.
And I'm
happy to be a mother too.
And she feeds us. She feeds us with her love. She feeds us with the good foods of the earth. And she fed us with Jesus, because she sent Jesus to show us that we're all loved by God and to invite us to dine with God. This meal is a meal with God. with the